In the dead of night, the man realizes that his dog refuses to come out of the rain, protecting something mysterious. Tension builds as he discovers a fox hiding with her cubs in the darkness. The animal's posture defies any attempt to get closer. What he does could change the fate of everyone in that little refuge. The full moon dimly illuminated the night sky over the hills of Montana. On a small farm on the outskirts of Wheatville, Ethan Olson prepared for another quiet night. At 45 years old, this rancher with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands from hard work found peace in the simplicity of his rural life. As he closed the curtains of his modest house, his gaze lingered on the figure of Whiskey, his faithful German shepherd resting in front of his doghouse in the yard. A smile spread across Ethan's face as he remembered how, 6 years ago, he had found that abandoned puppy on the highway. Since then, Whiskey had become his inseparable companion. "Whiskey boy, it's time for bed," called Ethan, expecting to see his dog enter the doghouse as he did every night. However, Whiskey remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the darkness. Intrigued by this unusual behavior, Ethan went out to the yard. The air was heavy with humidity, foreshadowing the arrival of a storm. "Come on, buddy, get inside before it starts to rain," he insisted, approaching the doghouse. To his surprise, Whiskey stood up and placed himself between Ethan and the entrance to the doghouse, growling softly. Ethan stepped back, bewildered. "What's wrong with you, boy? You've never acted like this before." At that moment, the first raindrops began to fall. Ethan decided to return to the house, thinking that Whiskey would enter the doghouse when the rain intensified. However, as the night progressed and the storm grew stronger, the dog remained in the same position, getting soaked in the pouring rain. Worried, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he looked out the window, he saw Whiskey in the same position, like a tireless guardian. What could he be protecting, he wondered, his mind wandering between increasingly far-fetched theories. The next morning, the rain had subsided, but the sky remained overcast. Ethan went out early, determined to discover what was happening. Whiskey, exhausted but alert, was still at his post. "That's enough, friend," Ethan said firmly, approaching the doghouse. But when he tried to move Whiskey aside, the dog growled more forcefully, baring his teeth. Ethan stepped back, surprised and a little hurt. He had never seen his faithful companion behave so aggressively. Determined to solve the mystery, Ethan devised a plan. He went into the house and came out with a piece of fresh meat. "Look what I've got, Whiskey," he said, waving the steak in the air. The dog's eyes followed the movement of the meat, but he remained in position. Slowly, Ethan began to move away from the doghouse, tempting Whiskey with the aroma of the meat. After a few moments of hesitation, hunger and fatigue overcame his determination, and Whiskey reluctantly followed his owner to the kitchen. Taking advantage of the distraction, Ethan ran back to the yard. He could hear Whiskey's desperate barks from the house, but this time he didn't stop. With his heart racing, he approached the doghouse and looked inside. What he saw took his breath away. Curled up in a corner, a red-furred vixen looked at him with fearful eyes. Around her, 4 small cubs huddled against her body, seeking warmth and protection. Ethan stepped back, astonished. Suddenly, everything made sense. Whiskey's protective behavior, his refusal to abandon his post in the rain. His faithful friend had not only found these animals in need, but had also assumed the role of their protector. As Ethan processed this revelation, Whiskey appeared at his side, panting after having managed to escape from the kitchen. The dog looked at his owner, and then at the Fox family as if asking for understanding. At that moment, Ethan realized he was at a crossroads. What should he do with these unexpected visitors? How would this affect his life and Whiskey's? As the storm resumed in the distance, Ethan knew that the decisions he would make in the coming hours would change the course of their lives forever. The rain intensified again as Ethan contemplated the scene before him. The mother fox, still distrustful, kept her cubs close, her eyes never leaving the man who had invaded their refuge. Whiskey, for his part, remained alert, torn between his loyalty to Ethan and his protective instinct towards the Fox family. "Oh, Whiskey, what have we gotten ourselves into?" muttered Ethan, running a hand through his wet hair. The dilemma was evident. He couldn't simply throw the foxes out into the storm, but he wasn't sure how to handle the situation either. Suddenly, thunder rumbled in the sky, startling everyone. The fox cubs whimpered, cuddling closer to their mother. It was then that Ethan noticed something alarming. One of the cubs seemed weaker than the others, barely moving. Without thinking twice, Ethan moved closer to examine the cub better. The mother fox growled threateningly, but Whiskey intervened, placing himself between them and emitting a soft bark, as if trying to calm both parties. "Easy, Mama," Ethan said in a soft voice. "I just want to help." With slow and careful movements, he managed to get close enough to see that the smallest cub had a wound on one of its paws. At that moment, an ominous cracking sound resonated above the roar of the storm. Ethan barely had time to react when a huge branch broke off from a nearby tree, falling with a deafening crash right next to the doghouse. The impact shook the structure, threatening to collapse it. "Quick, we need to get them out of here," Ethan shouted. Without hesitation, he lunged towards the doghouse, gathering the cubs in his arms. The mother fox, overcoming her initial fear, allowed Ethan to touch them, as if understanding the imminent danger. Whiskey barked urgently, guiding the way to the house. Ethan followed, carrying the cubs while the mother fox ran by his side. Together they rushed into the house just as another thunderclap shook the sky. Once inside, Ethan carefully placed the cubs on the kitchen floor. The mother fox immediately approached them, licking them and making sure they were all right. Whiskey sat nearby, vigilant but respectful. Ethan moved quickly, searching for towels and old blankets to dry and warm the animals. As he worked, he couldn't help but marvel at the surreal scene in his kitchen. A German shepherd, a family of foxes, and himself, all united by circumstances. "Well, it looks like we'll have company for a while," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the animals. He knelt beside the injured cub, carefully examining its paw. "It's not serious, but it'll need attention," he diagnosed. As Ethan cleaned and bandaged the cub's wound, his mind wandered to the future. What would happen when the storm ended? Could the foxes simply return to the forest? And more importantly, how would this affect his relationship with Whiskey? The night wore on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Ethan improvised a small shelter in a corner of the kitchen for the fox family, using boxes and blankets. Whiskey lay down nearby, keeping a watchful eye on his charges. Exhausted but unable to sleep, Ethan sat in a chair observing the scene before him. At that moment, he noticed something strange in Whiskey's behavior. The dog seemed restless, constantly looking towards the window. Intrigued, Ethan approached the window and peered into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the curtain of rain. But then, a movement caught his attention. Among the bushes, he thought he saw a flash of bright eyes and reddish fur. "It can't be," Ethan whispered, his heart racing. Could it be the father of the cubs, looking for his family? The presence of this new player added another layer of complexity to the already complicated situation. Ethan knew that the decisions he would make in the coming hours would not only affect the animals under his care, but would also test his own compassion and understanding of nature. As the storm raged outside, Ethan prepared for a long and unpredictable night, aware that the real challenge was just beginning. Dawn arrived with a deceptive calm. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a grey sky and air heavy with humidity. Ethan, who had barely slept, rose from the chair where he had spent the night watching over his unusual guests. The Fox family was still curled up in the corner of the kitchen, with Whiskey standing guard nearby. The dog raised his head when he saw his owner, his eyes tired but alert. "Good morning, friend," Ethan murmured, gently patting Whiskey's head. "You've done a good job." As he prepared coffee, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen the night before. Was there really a male fox prowling around the house? And if so, how would this affect the situation? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft whimper. The injured cub was waking up, visibly uncomfortable. Ethan approached cautiously, aware of the mother fox's watchful gaze. "Easy, little one," he whispered, examining the bandaged paw. The wound seemed to be better, but the cub would need more care. Suddenly, a movement at the window caught his attention. There, on the windowsill, was the male fox he had glimpsed the night before. His amber eyes scanned the interior of the kitchen, a mixture of curiosity and distrust in his gaze. Whiskey immediately went on alert, a low growl forming in his throat. Ethan calmed him with a gesture, not taking his eyes off the newcomer. "So you've come to look for your family," he said quietly, as if the fox could understand him. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. The mother fox looked alternately at Ethan and the male in the window, as if assessing the situation. The cubs, oblivious to the drama unfolding, played among themselves, including the small injured one that seemed to be regaining its strength. Ethan knew he had to act carefully. One wrong move could scare the male fox and potentially endanger everyone. Slowly, he approached the window and opened it a little more. "Come on, friend," he said softly. "Your family is safe here." The fox hesitated, its muscles tense, ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. Whiskey, surprisingly, remained still, as if understanding the delicacy of the situation. Several minutes passed in tense silence. Finally, the male fox took a tentative step into the kitchen. The mother fox emitted a soft sound, almost like a greeting, and the cubs stirred with excitement. Ethan slowly backed away, giving the family space to reunite. In amazement, he watched as the male approached his mate and cubs, sniffing them and making sure they were all right. However, the peace was short-lived. A loud noise from outside startled everyone. The male fox, alarmed, jumped back to the window and disappeared into the bushes in the yard. "Wait!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. The fox was gone, leaving behind an atmosphere of confusion and disappointment. The mother fox seemed restless, torn between the desire to follow her mate and the need to protect her cubs. Whiskey approached her, as if offering comfort, and to Ethan's surprise, the vixen didn't reject him. "Well, it looks like we have a new challenge," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. The situation had become even more complicated. Not only did he have to care for the fox family, but now he also had to find a way to gain the trust of the elusive father. As he contemplated his options, Ethan couldn't help but notice how Whiskey seemed to have assumed the role of mediator between the human and animal worlds. The dog moved easily between Ethan and the foxes, like a living bridge between species. This observation sparked an idea in Ethan's mind. Maybe, with Whiskey's help, he could find a way to approach the male fox and convince him that his family was safe. With renewed determination, Ethan began to devise a plan. He knew the next few days would be crucial, not only for the well-being of the fox family, but also for his own understanding of the delicate relationship between humans and nature. As he prepared to face this new challenge, Ethan couldn't help but wonder how this experience would change his life and Whiskey's forever. What had begun as an act of compassion was quickly turning into a life lesson about love, loyalty, and the bonds that transcend barriers between species. The following days passed in an unusual but increasingly familiar routine. Ethan divided his time between tending to the farm, caring for the fox family, and trying to gain the trust of the elusive male fox, whom he had started calling Shadow due to his fleeting appearances. One morning, as Ethan was checking the injured cub's paw, he noticed that Whiskey was restless, constantly looking towards the door. "What's wrong, boy?" Ethan asked, intrigued by his faithful friend's behavior. In response, Whiskey went to the door and began to scratch it gently. Ethan, curious, followed him outside. What he saw took his breath away. There, at the edge of the forest surrounding his property, was Shadow. The male fox was watching them intently, his posture tense but not threatening. Ethan resisted the urge to approach, aware that any sudden movement could scare him away. To his surprise, it was Whiskey who made the first move. The dog slowly advanced towards Shadow, his body language conveying calm and absence of threat. Shadow, for his part, remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the approaching dog. Ethan watched, fascinated, as the two animals met at a midpoint. There were no growls or signs of aggression. Instead, Whiskey and Shadow sniffed each other as if exchanging information. After what seemed like an eternity, Shadow took a step back and, with a final look towards the house, disappeared into the forest. Whiskey returned trotting to Ethan, looking strangely satisfied. "You're a natural diplomat, huh?" Ethan joked, petting his dog. But deep down, he knew he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Whiskey had achieved what he hadn't been able to, establish real first contact with Shadow. This encounter marked a turning point. In the following days, Shadow began to approach the house more, always maintaining a prudent distance but clearly interested in his family. Ethan, following Whiskey's example, learned to move calmly and respect the fox's space. One afternoon, as Ethan was working in the garden, he noticed that the mother fox seemed restless. Her cubs, now more active, were exploring the kitchen under Whiskey's watchful eye, but she kept looking towards the window. Following his instinct, Ethan approached the window and opened it completely. Then, with slow and deliberate movements, he stepped away, giving space. It wasn't long before Shadow appeared on the windowsill. This time, however, he didn't flee. Cautiously, the male fox entered the kitchen, finally reuniting with his family after days of separation. Ethan observed the scene with his heart full of emotion. The fox family was reunited, the cubs joyfully jumping around their father, while the mother rubbed her snout against Shadow's in a gesture of affection. Whiskey, sitting next to Ethan, seemed to share his owner's joy. The dog had played a crucial role in this reunion, and Ethan couldn't be prouder of his companion. However, this happiness came with a bittersweet realization. Ethan knew he couldn't keep the fox family indefinitely. They were wild animals, and eventually they would have to return to their natural habitat. As he contemplated this dilemma, Ethan began to formulate a plan. Perhaps he could build a shelter on the edge of his property, a safe place where the fox family could live without completely moving away. That night, as the fox family slept peacefully in the kitchen, with Whiskey standing guard, Ethan sat down to draw plans for the new shelter. He knew the next few days would be crucial for the future of these animals that, unexpectedly, had become part of his life. As he worked, he couldn't help but reflect on how this experience had changed his perspective. He had learned about compassion, not only from his own actions but also from Whiskey's. He had seen how barriers between species could blur in the name of love and protection. With each stroke on the paper, Ethan felt he was drawing not just a shelter, but a new chapter in his life. A chapter where the line between domestic and wild became blurred, and where the deepest lessons came from the most unexpected places. As the pencil glided across the paper, Ethan wondered what other challenges and surprises this new adventure would bring. The only thing he knew for certain was that, with Whiskey by his side and this unusual family under his care, he was ready to face whatever came. The following days passed in a frenzy of activity. Ethan, with occasional help from Whiskey, who seemed to enjoy carrying small tools in his mouth, began construction on the shelter for the fox family at the edge of his property. As he worked under the scorching afternoon sun, Ethan couldn't help but notice that the weather was changing. The air was becoming increasingly heavy, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. A new storm was approaching, and this time it seemed to be stronger than the previous one. "We need to hurry, Whiskey," Ethan muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. The dog barked in response, as if understanding the urgency of the situation. In the house, the fox family also seemed to sense the coming storm. Shadow appeared restless, going back and forth from the window to his mate and cubs. The mother fox, for her part, kept her little ones close, as if preparing for what was to come. That night, as Ethan was having dinner with his unusual company, thunder rumbled in the distance. Whiskey immediately went on alert, and the foxes huddled closer to each other. "It's okay," Ethan said softly. "You're safe here." However, as the night progressed and the storm intensified, Ethan began to worry. The shelter wasn't finished yet, and the force of the rain and wind threatened to damage what he had already built. In the middle of the night, an alarming cracking sound woke him up. Jumping out of bed, Ethan ran to the window. What he saw chilled his blood. A nearby tree had split in half, and one of its enormous branches had fallen dangerously close to the shelter under construction. Without thinking twice, Ethan quickly dressed and went out into the downpour with Whiskey at his heels. Together, man and dog fought against the wind and rain to secure what they could of the shelter. As they worked, Ethan noticed movement in the darkness. To his surprise, Shadow had come out of the house and was observing their efforts from a safe distance. For a moment their gazes met, and Ethan felt a strange connection with the wild animal. Suddenly, lightning illuminated the sky, immediately followed by deafening thunder. Shadow, frightened, jumped and ran towards the forest. "No, wait!" Ethan shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the storm. Without thinking, Ethan rushed after the fox, with Whiskey by his side. They ventured into the dark and soaked forest, guided only by occasional flashes of lightning. The search seemed endless. Ethan, soaked to the bone and covered in mud, was beginning to lose hope. It was then that Whiskey started barking insistently, pulling at the sleeve of his shirt. Following his faithful companion, Ethan reached a small clearing. There, curled up under the roots of a fallen tree, was Shadow. The fox was trembling, clearly terrified by the storm. With infinite care, Ethan approached. "It's okay, friend," he murmured softly. "We're going to take you home." To his surprise, Shadow didn't flee. Perhaps too scared to move, or perhaps finally recognizing Ethan as an ally, the fox allowed the man to lift him into his arms. The return to the house was arduous. Ethan, carrying Shadow and Whiskey leading the way, fought against the storm. When they finally arrived, they were exhausted but triumphant. In the kitchen, the mother fox and her cubs received Shadow with obvious relief. Ethan watched, moved as the family reunited, licking and cuddling together for warmth and comfort. As he dried himself with a towel, Ethan reflected on what had happened. Tonight he had crossed a line, risking his own safety for an animal that, until recently, he considered a stranger. But looking at the Fox family, at Whiskey sitting faithfully by his side, and feeling the fatigue and satisfaction in his bones, Ethan realized something important. They were no longer strangers. Somehow, amidst literal and metaphorical storms, they had become a strange but undeniable family. With this realization, Ethan felt something change within him. It was no longer just about providing temporary shelter. Now he understood that his fate was intertwined with that of these animals, and that together they would face whatever the future held. As the storm raged outside, peace reigned in the small kitchen, born of mutual trust and care. And although the outdoor shelter was not yet finished, Ethan understood that they had already built something much more important: a home. The morning after the storm dawned with a surreal calm. Ethan went out early to assess the damage, with Whiskey faithfully following him. The shelter for the foxes had suffered some damage, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. As he worked on the repairs, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how his life had changed in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, his days passed in a solitary routine, interrupted only by occasional visits from his younger sister, Sarah. As if his thoughts had summoned her, Ethan heard the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road. He immediately recognized Sarah's old pickup truck. "Ethan?" Sarah called out as she got out of the vehicle. "Are you okay? I came as soon as I could after the storm." Ethan tensed. He hadn't considered how he would explain the presence of a fox family in his house. Sarah, though loving, had always been more practical than him when it came to life on the farm. "I'm fine, Sarah," he replied, hugging his sister, "but there's something I need to show you." With some apprehension, Ethan guided Sarah towards the house, explaining the situation along the way. To his surprise, Sarah listened in silence, her expression unreadable. Upon entering the kitchen, they encountered a touching scene. The Fox family was cuddled together, with Whiskey standing guard nearby. Shadow, still recovering from his nighttime scare, raised his head as they entered. Sarah was speechless for a moment. Then, to Ethan's amazement, a smile spread across her face. "Oh, Ethan," she said softly, "you've always been the soft-hearted one in the family." Her reaction triggered a flood of memories for Ethan. Suddenly, he was transported back to his childhood, when he and Sarah found a fallen bird's nest after a storm. He remembered how they had secretly cared for the chicks, against their parents' wishes, until they could fly. "Remember the sparrows?" Sarah asked, as if reading his thoughts. Ethan nodded, moved by the shared memory. "I never thought I'd do something like that again." Sarah approached the Fox family, observing them with curiosity. "Well, brother, it seems some things never change, but this time you're not alone. How can I help?" Sarah's offer of help was like a balm for Ethan. Together they spent the day repairing the shelter and discussing plans for the future. Sarah, with her veterinary experience, examined the cubs and the mother, ensuring they were healthy. As they worked, Ethan shared with Sarah his doubts and fears. Was he doing the right thing by intervening in the lives of these wild animals? What would happen when the time came to let them go? Sarah listened patiently, offering her perspective. "Ethan," she finally said, "what you're doing is extraordinary. Yes, eventually they'll have to return to nature, but you're giving them a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise." As the day progressed, Ethan noticed a subtle change in the fox's behavior. Shadow, in particular, seemed more relaxed in Sarah's presence, as if he had expanded his circle of trust. That night, sitting on the porch as they watched Whiskey play with the fox cubs under the watchful eye of their parents, Ethan felt overwhelmed by a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you for understanding," he said to Sarah, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah smiled, squeezing her brother's hand. "We're family, Ethan. And it seems our family has just grown a little bigger." As the sun set, painting the sky in golden and pink hues, Ethan reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. What began as an act of compassion had turned into an adventure that was healing old wounds and creating new bonds. With Sarah by his side and this new and peculiar family under his care, Ethan felt for the first time in a long time truly at home. And although he knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, he also knew that he would no longer have to face them alone. The following weeks brought a surprisingly harmonious routine to Ethan's farm. With Sarah's help, who now visited more frequently, the shelter for the foxes was finally completed. It was a sturdy but cozy structure, located at the edge of the property where the forest met the fields. One sunny morning, Ethan watched the fox cubs playing in the yard, their paws now firmer, their movements more confident. Whiskey, always vigilant, supervised the games, occasionally participating with a measured enthusiasm that made Ethan smile. "They're growing fast," Sarah commented, joining her brother on the porch. Ethan nodded, a mixture of pride and melancholy in his voice. Yes, they'll soon be ready for an independent life. The realization hung between them, unspoken but understood. The time for farewell was approaching. That afternoon, as Ethan worked in the field, he noticed Shadow watching him from the edge of the forest. The male fox, once so elusive, now seemed to seek Ethan's company almost as much as that of his own family. Pausing in his work, Ethan slowly approached Shadow. To his surprise, the fox didn't retreat. Instead, he sat down, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that seemed to convey more than words could express. "You know the time is coming too, don't you?" Ethan murmured, feeling a lump in his throat. As if in response, Shadow let out a soft howl, a sound Ethan had never heard before. It was almost melancholic. The following days brought subtle but significant changes. The cubs, now almost the size of their parents, began to make longer excursions around the property, always returning at nightfall. The mother fox, though still protective, allowed these explorations with a resignation that spoke of her natural instinct. Whiskey, for his part, seemed to sense the impending change. The dog spent more time near the fox's shelter, as if wanting to make the most of every remaining moment with his unlikely friends. One evening, as Ethan and Sarah were having dinner on the porch, watching the sunset, a commotion caught their attention. Whiskey was barking insistently near the edge of the forest. Running to investigate, they found an alarming scene. One of the fox cubs was trapped in an old rabbit trap, a forgotten remnant from the times when the land was used for hunting. "Quick, Sarah," Ethan shouted, his heart racing. "Bring your first aid kit." Working together, with Whiskey keeping the other foxes calm, Ethan and Sarah managed to free the cub. Fortunately, the wounds were superficial, but the incident served as a painful reminder of the dangers the foxes would face in the wild. That night, after the injured cub was treated and resting comfortably with its family, Ethan sat alone on the porch, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "What should I do, Whiskey?" he asked his faithful companion, who rested his head on Ethan's lap. "How can I protect them out there?" The answer, of course, didn't come, but as the night wore on, a resolution began to form in Ethan's mind. He couldn't control nature or eliminate all dangers, but he could do more than just let them go. The next morning, Ethan shared his plan with Sarah. They would transform part of the property into a natural sanctuary, a place where foxes and other wild animals could live protected yet free. "It will be a lot of work," Sarah warned, though her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "Yes," Ethan agreed, "but it's worth it. For them, for Whiskey, for us." As they discussed the details, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had begun as an act of kindness towards a fox family was evolving into a life mission. Looking at Whiskey, who was attentively watching the fox family playing in the yard, Ethan smiled. "It looks like we've found our calling, buddy," he said, patting the dog's head. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant colors, as if celebrating the birth of this new vision. Ethan knew the road ahead would be challenging, but with Sarah, Whiskey, and the inspiration this fox family had brought to his life, he felt ready to face any obstacle. The transformation was not just of the land, Ethan realized. It was a transformation of hearts, of purpose, of family. And as he watched this new chapter of his life unfold, Ethan felt a deep gratitude for the unexpected gift that an act of kindness had brought. Ethan and Sarah's plan to create a natural sanctuary on the property was progressing well. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries, but also a growing sense of purpose. The Fox family, now fully recovered, had adapted well to their improved shelter. One morning, as Ethan was overseeing the construction of a new protective fence, he noticed something unusual. Whiskey, normally always by his side, was nowhere to be found. Worried, Ethan began to search for him. "Whiskey, Whiskey!" he called out as he walked around the property. His heart raced when he heard a faint bark coming from the forest. Following the sound, Ethan ventured into the trees. What he found left him breathless. Whiskey was lying on the ground, visibly injured. To Ethan's surprise, Shadow, the male fox, was beside him, seeming to stand guard. "What happened, buddy?" Ethan murmured, kneeling beside his faithful companion. Whiskey whimpered softly, his hind leg bleeding from what appeared to be a bite. Carefully, Ethan lifted Whiskey in his arms. Shadow followed them closely as they returned to the house, as if wanting to ensure the dog would be okay. Sarah, who fortunately was visiting that day, examined Whiskey. "It looks like a coyote bite," she diagnosed. "It's not serious, but he'll need antibiotics and rest." As they tended to Whiskey, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the scene. Shadow had refused to leave the porch, maintaining a silent vigil for the injured dog. The mother fox and the cubs had also approached, as if sensing something was wrong. "I never thought I'd see something like this," Sarah commented, observing the interaction between the animals. "It's as if they really cared for each other." Ethan nodded, moved. "I wonder if Whiskey tried to protect them from the coyote," he reflected. The following days brought a new dynamic to the farm. As Whiskey recovered, the foxes seemed to have assumed the role of guardians. Shadow, in particular, spent hours patrolling the boundaries of the property, as if returning the favor to Whiskey. This new reality brought with it new challenges. Ethan realized that the sanctuary they were creating would not only attract animals in need of protection, but also predators in search of easy prey. "We need to find a balance," he said to Sarah one night as they discussed their plans. "We want to protect the animals, but we can't interfere too much with the natural order." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we could create different zones within the sanctuary," she suggested. "More protected areas for vulnerable animals, and others where nature can take its course." As they worked on this new approach, Ethan noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the fox family. The cubs, now almost adults, began to show signs of wanting to explore beyond the boundaries of the sanctuary. Shadow and the mother fox seemed torn between their instinct to protect their cubs and the need to let them grow. One afternoon, as Ethan watched one of the cubs venture beyond the fence, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Sarah. "You know we'll have to let them go soon, right?" she said softly. Ethan nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I know, but it's hard." "It is," Sarah agreed. "But look at all we've accomplished. This sanctuary hasn't just helped them. It will help many other animals in the future." That night, as Ethan sat on the porch with the recovered Whiskey at his feet, he reflected on the incredible journey they had embarked on. What began as an act of kindness towards a fox family had become a life mission. Looking towards the shelter, where Shadow and his family rested under the stars, Ethan felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia. He knew that the day of farewell was approaching, but he also understood that this was not the end, but the beginning of something much bigger. With Whiskey by his side and Sarah's determination backing him up, Ethan felt ready to face any challenge the future might bring. The sanctuary was more than a refuge for animals. It had become a symbol of hope, compassion, and the incredible connection that can exist between all creatures. As the sun set, painting the sky in warm hues, Ethan smiled. Although the road ahead would be difficult, he knew that every step would be worth it. And who knows, he thought, maybe someday Shadow and his family would return, bringing with them new stories and new challenges. Autumn arrived at Ethan's farm, painting the landscape in golden and reddish hues. The natural sanctuary he had created along with Sarah was flourishing, attracting a variety of wildlife. However, for Ethan, the focus remained on the fox family that had changed his life. The cubs, now young adults, showed increasing signs of wanting to explore beyond the boundaries of the sanctuary. Ethan watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety as they ventured further and further, always returning at nightfall. One afternoon, as Ethan and Sarah were working on a new section of the sanctuary, Whiskey began to bark insistently. They ran towards the sound and found the dog at the edge of the forest, clearly agitated. "What's wrong, boy?" Ethan asked, patting Whiskey's head. In response, Whiskey ventured into the forest, looking back to make sure they were following him. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a worried look before following the dog. After several minutes of walking, they reached a small clearing. There, to their surprise, they found Shadow and the mother fox. But what really caught their attention was what was with them. 3 young foxes, clearly injured and scared. "My God," Sarah whispered, approaching cautiously. "They seem to have been attacked by something. Maybe wild dogs." Ethan observed how Shadow and his mate cared for the young foxes, licking them and comforting them. It was evident that they had brought them here seeking help. "It's incredible," Ethan murmured. "They trusted us enough to bring them here. With great care and patience, they managed to bring the injured foxes back to the sanctuary." Sarah, putting her veterinary skills into practice, tended to their wounds while Ethan prepared a safe space for them to recover. The following days were intense. Ethan and Sarah took turns caring for the injured foxes, with constant help from Whiskey and Shadow's family. It was as if everyone understood the importance of working together. One night, as Ethan was watching over the recovering foxes, he noticed something extraordinary. Shadow and his family had brought food for the young injured foxes, sharing what they had hunted. This act of compassion between animals deeply moved him. "They never cease to amaze me," he told Sarah when she arrived for the shift change. "It's as if they really understood the concept of community." Sarah smiled, nodding. "Maybe they do. And maybe we're part of that community now." As the young foxes recovered, Ethan noticed a change in Shadow and his family's behavior. They seemed more determined to stay close to the sanctuary, as if they had found a new purpose. One afternoon, as he watched Shadow's cubs playing with the rescued foxes, Ethan had an epiphany. "Sarah," he called to his sister, who was nearby, "I think I understand what's happening." "What do you mean?" she asked, approaching. "Look at them," Ethan said, pointing to the foxes. "Shadow and his family, they're not preparing to leave. They're establishing their territory here in the sanctuary. They're making this place their permanent home." Sarah observed the scene, a smile forming on her face. "You're right. It's as if they've decided this is the best place to raise their family and help others." This realization brought a new wave of emotions for Ethan. The fear of inevitable separation transformed into the joy of a lasting connection. The sanctuary was not just a temporary refuge, but a true home for these incredible animals. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah said, with a glint in her eyes. "Our sanctuary isn't just a place of refuge. It's becoming a center for rehabilitation and natural education." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of excitement. "And who better to help us than Shadow and his family? They're like natural ambassadors." That night, sitting on the porch with Whiskey at his feet and the sound of foxes in the distance, Ethan reflected on the incredible journey he had undertaken. What began as an act of kindness had become a life mission, one he shared not only with his sister and his faithful dog, but with a fox family he had come to consider as his own. As the sun set, painting the sky in bright colors, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. The future was full of possibilities, challenges, and above all, the promise of more amazing stories to come. A year had passed since Ethan found Whiskey protecting the fox family during that stormy night. The natural sanctuary that had emerged from that fortuitous encounter had become a true paradise for wildlife, attracting the attention of conservationists and nature lovers from all over the region. It was a cool spring morning when Ethan stepped out onto the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Whiskey, now a bit slower but equally loyal, followed him, sitting by his side to watch the sunrise. "Good morning, old friend," Ethan murmured, patting the dog's head. "Ready for another exciting day?" As if answering his question, a movement at the edge of the forest caught his attention. Shadow emerged from among the trees, followed by his mate and a new litter of cubs. Behind them, to Ethan's surprise and delight, came the young foxes they had rescued months ago, now fully recovered and forming an integral part of the extended family. "Sarah," Ethan called, without taking his eyes off the scene, "you've got to see this." His sister quickly came out, camera in hand. They had been documenting the evolution of the sanctuary and the behavior of its inhabitants, and this scene was too precious to miss. "It's incredible," Sarah whispered, capturing the moment. "It's as if they come to greet us every morning." Ethan nodded, a smile spreading across his face. They're part of the family now. "We all are." As they watched, Shadow approached the porch more confident than ever. He sat at a respectful distance, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan and Sarah. It was a gesture they had come to interpret as an invitation. "Come on," Ethan said, standing up. "I think they want to show us something." They followed the Fox family to a part of the sanctuary they had designated as a rehabilitation area. There, to their amazement, they found a young, injured deer, carefully guided to the spot by the foxes. "I can't believe it," Sarah exclaimed, examining the animal. "It seems to have hurt its leg. How did they know to bring it here?" Ethan watched in wonder as Shadow and his family moved around the deer, calming it with their presence. "They've learned," he said softly. "They understand what we do here and want to help." As they tended to the injured deer, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The sanctuary had become much more than a refuge. It was a model of coexistence and mutual understanding between species. Throughout the day, visitors arrived at the sanctuary, students, researchers, and families, all eager to learn about wildlife and the importance of conservation. Ethan and Sarah guided them, sharing not only knowledge but also the incredible stories of Shadow, Whiskey, and the other animals that called this place home. At sunset, as the sun sank over the sanctuary, Ethan found himself back on the porch, this time accompanied by Sarah. Whiskey rested at their feet, and in the distance they could see Shadow and his family returning to the forest for the night. "Did you ever imagine we'd get to this point when you found those foxes that night?" Sarah asked. Ethan shook his head, smiling. "Not in my wildest dreams, but now I can't imagine life any other way." "You've created something beautiful here, Ethan," Sarah said, squeezing her brother's shoulder, "something that will endure long after us." Ethan nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. "We've created it together," he corrected, "all of us. Of humans and animals alike." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan thought about the incredible journey this past year had been. What began as an act of compassion had become a life mission, transforming not only his property, but also his heart and his understanding of the natural world. Shadow's distant howl echoed in the night, like a farewell and a promise of a new day to come. Ethan smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new wonders, and above all, new opportunities to make the world a better place, one animal at a time. As they entered the house, with Whiskey faithfully following them, Ethan took one last look at the sanctuary bathed in moonlight. This wasn't the end of their story, he realized. It was just the beginning of a new and exciting chapter in the great narrative of life.